It's a new day on Deep Space Nine, and we're in a meeting. Senator Kretak's back after removing those unwelcome space nukes from a Bajoran moon, and she's sufficiently patched up her relationship with Kara as to be discussing ship maintenance. Maybe it's because we're using a different actor this time. Either way, they won't be friendly for long, as she's off to Romulus for a conference. So too is Bashir, a topic discussed with Plain Simple Garak, as he spent some time there as a gardener, allegedly. Bashir's going as an expert on matters of medicine, specifically Dominion biological warfare and Ketracel White. Plain Simple Garak thinks this would be a great opportunity to grab some valuable intel on the Romulans, an idea Bashir says simply wouldn't be cricket while they're our allies. Sloan of Section 31 disagrees, which is why Bashir wakes to find him in his quarters later. He's got a job for Bashir, and he's not going to let a little thing like Bashir saying he doesn't want it get in the way. In short, Sloan's of the same opinion as Plain Simple Garak regarding the Romulans. The Klingons and Cardigans had already knocked the shit out of each other before our current ding-dong kicked off, so it'll be the Federation and the Romulans who come out of this with the least damage. Data on their leadership might help us plan how that will play out. Sloan leaves as Bashir tries to decline again, disappearing from the corridor outside. It comes as no surprise that Sloan didn't leave any evidence of his presence. Sisko's spoken to Admiral Ross, who's also going to this conference, and he says it's too important to call off. Which doesn't really matter anyway, as Sisko thinks having a man inside Section 31 will help us figure out who in Starfleet Command is secretly protecting them, so he tells Bashir to play along. Off to Romulus we go on the USS Not Voyager. Bashir's getting wankered with Kretak and Ross at a reception when Sloan pokes his head in to say hi. Or should we say Wendell Greer, as that's the name of his cover as a Federation map maker. He pulls Bashir to one side and, ignoring the question of why Bashir was needed when he came along himself, Sloan tells him there's some data to study in his quarters. Ross is in on our little trap, it seems, as Bashir's telling him about Sloan shortly thereafter. Bashir thinks letting this continue is too dangerous now Sloan's involved, but Ross overrules him. Sloan's cover doesn't have access to the high-security rooms at the conference, so he believes the risk is worth finding out what's so important that Sloan himself would choose to come along. Briefing time for Bashir, and Sloan's making sure he's absorbed it all. We cover Naral, the new boss lad of the Romulans, and Koval, who's in charge of the Tal Shiar intelligence agency. Koval in particular is of interest to Sloan for a few reasons. He's potentially implicated in the death of a Starfleet intelligence admiral, he's vocally opposed to the Federation alliance, and he's also aiming for a currently vacant position of political power. Sloan thinks Kretak would be a far more favourable choice for the job from our point of view. Koval's also suspected of having a neurological condition that Sloan wants Bashir to try and confirm. Bashir concludes Sloan will use this information to prevent Koval from becoming more influential, an idea Sloan sidesteps. Besides, all Bashir has to do is say yes or no to Koval having the condition, so his hands will be clean regardless. At least this Koval lad is making Bashir's job easier by taking an interest in him. To be more specific, he's interested in the Dominion's use of biological weapons like the Quickening. To be even more specific, he's interested in whether such weapons can be copied. Kretak comes over once Koval's gone to compliment Bashir. Koval doesn't give his time to just anyone, and even fewer from Starfleet, given his anti-alliance views. That's one of the reasons she and Koval don't get on. Koval's equally interested during Bashir's lecture on the topic, something noted by Sloan afterwards. Sloan's here for Bashir's medical opinion on Koval, though, and based on what he's seen, Bashir thinks Koval might indeed have the condition. If so, it's early days, which means he's probably got another 20 years in him before it's terminal, which is long enough to cause us problems. Sloan asks if there's anything that could make the condition act faster. When Bashir decides he doesn't much care for that line of questioning, Sloan buggers off instead. Time to report to Admiral Ross, thinks Bashir. He's confused why Sloan would want the head of the Tal Shiar dead, but Bashir says it's more about wanting Kretak to get the currently available political job. Given how much of a stink murdering Koval would cause, Ross decides it's time to detain Sloan. Ross also thinks he might not be working alone though, and Bashir agrees. In fact, he thinks it might be another Romulan, based on how close to Koval whoever was going to trigger an acceleration of his condition would need to get. That's why he wants to warn the Romulans. Ross shoots that down immediately, explaining that the Federation has a covert independent murder club called Section 31 might be as politically awkward as the assassination itself. Ross instead tells Bashir to wait until he hears back from Starfleet Command. He's going to be waiting for a while then. Bashir learns that Admiral Ross has had a completely unexpected health upsie and is now in sickbay. He didn't even have a chance to arrest Sloan. Bashir's decided the only person he can trust is Kretak, which... yeah, okay then. He tells her everything he knows, and she says that tracks, as Koval's had suspicions about a Starfleet spy for a while. The solution? Bashir wants her to find, copy, and furnish him with the most secret files of the head of an intelligence agency, because that might help identify the spy. She's obviously a tad hesitant to do that, what with it being completely fucking bonkers, but he pulls a sad face and talks about cooperation, so she agrees. While she gets on with that, Bashir tries to convince Sloan he was wrong about the diagnosis. Sloan tells him he can make sure by using hand glue to nick some of Koval's cells when they shake hands next, and test them. Koval's less interested in talking to Bashir about bioweapons this time round, but he does have another topic to discuss. Bashir's led to a distinctly unpleasant-looking room and strapped to a chair, as Koval demands to know what he's really doing here, and who he works for. A little later, Koval has learned the standard techniques of data extraction don't work on Bashir due to his souped-up brain. When Bashir refuses to answer questions, he's instead taken before the Romulan Continuing Committee, the same political body that currently has a vacancy on it. Kretak's already there, but then that's to be expected when she was caught trying to break into the files of the Tal Shiar. She says it was to prevent an assassination, and Bashir corroborates her story. Koval says there's more to it, though, and he's got another witness to present. Sloan here has undergone the same brainial gizmos as Bashir, says Koval, only his proved more fruitful. It provided details of a Starfleet intelligence operative called Sloan, who became convinced that Tal Shiar had murdered an admiral, one to whom he was personally close. His desire for revenge was such that he wanted to kill the person he thought responsible, but wasn't willing to risk war in the process. Thus was born Section 31, a fiction he created for the purpose of deflecting blame from the Federation if it all turned to shit. The Tal Shiar pride themselves on being very good at their jobs, though, so Sloan was known to them. His decision to come along made it obvious something was going on and caused the plan's failure. As to Kretak and Bashir, well, Bashir may or may not be involved, but that's largely irrelevant. Kretak, on the other hand, is either party to an attempted assassination in the hopes of filling the vacant position herself, or so gullible that she was led into treason by a single rogue intelligence operative. Either way, she's very buggered indeed. Sloan learning that he'll be a continuing guest of the Tal Shiar is not well received. He attempts to grab a weapon, and Koval himself poops green at him, leaving absolutely nothing behind. Bashir's flying home on the Not Voyager when he decides he wants a chat with Admiral Ross. He's looking pretty good for someone who had an aneurysm, but maybe that's future medicine for you. Or maybe not, as Bashir asks where Sloan is. Ross gives up trying to deny things after the first attempt, and instead agrees to talk if it's all off the record, saying Sloan's plan was to teleport away as the beam hit. Bashir figured there was something not quite right based on Koval saying Sloan was some amateur fueled by revenge, as that's not his experience of him. That got him to thinking how useful some of Ross's actions were in securing this outcome, like suggesting Sloan had an accomplice. That leaves us with the question of why we would want this result, the answer to which is that Koval must be working for us. That would explain why he was wrong about Sloan, and why we were willing to burn Kretak in the process of elevating Koval. Ross says Kretak was a fair-weather ally at best, supporting an alliance only while it served the Romulans. Koval, on the other hand, would have a change of heart and be all the more convincing for his previous opposition. As to why Ross would get involved with Section 31, he's sick of ordering good people to their deaths. It's not like he's the first Starfleet officer to discover that saving the Alpha Quadrant is worth the price of his self-respect. Once back on DS9, Bashir wakes to find Sloan in his quarters again. He's here to thank Bashir for being a moral man, someone willing to risk himself to prevent a murder. Protecting such ethics is why people like Sloan exist. He exits and Bashir decides there's no point in reporting it, so we'll leave Bashir to wonder just how well he should be able to sleep tonight, until the next adventure. Section 31 rears its ugly, extrajudicial head once more, back in the days when Trek writers still understood it wasn't a thing to be proud of or romanticize. This time we're interfering in the politics of third parties, like what proper clandestine groups do. I'm on record as enjoying intrigue and scheming, dialogue being of more interest to me than Kaboom's, so this should have been right up my alley. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite scratch that itch for me, as once you start to give things a little more consideration, there are a few elements that don't really stand up to scrutiny. First off, why trust Kretak? She and Bashir have no history together. All he'd have known was what Kira told him about the time Kretak installed space nukes on a Bajoran moon and refused to remove them until Starfleet forced her. She's also the person who has the most to gain from Koval being taken out of the picture. She's not exactly the logical choice for confidant based on either prior history or current circumstances. Next, why believe Koval's super-secret files would have enough data on a Starfleet intelligence spy to identify them when Koval himself hasn't done so? And, if this suspect list exists, why believe Koval would allow himself to be alone around people he already suspects because they're in his files? Thirdly, how would Kretak know where the head of the Tal Shiar, arguably the most capable intelligence organization in the Quadrant, keeps his super-secret files? And how would a senator know how to bypass the security around such files anyway? To put that into perspective, it's comparable to suggesting Jacob Rees-Mogg, British politician and Dickensian villain, is your best hope for breaking into GCHQ's most private stash. I'm all for the suspension of disbelief in stories, but there's a limit to how many tenuous threads you can have before things start to unravel. All of the above points happen because the conclusion of the story requires them, not because they stand up on their own merit. Any one of them taken in isolation would be questionable at best. Taken together, they serve to undermine much of what we're presented. And that is a shame. As I've said before, I love a good bit of the old ethically dubious stuff. Starfleet Command itself being party to, well, if not regime change, then at least regime influence, is another look at how an ostensibly moral society interacts with those who don't share their ideals. The problem for me is that In the Pale Moonlight gives us a far better example of the topics raised here, namely how far people will stray from those ideals to protect utopia, and does so without exonerating Sisko like we do with Bashir. In comparison, today's episode comes off looking like the B-side of a much better song. That's enough negative waves for one episode though, so let's wrap up by finding those silver linings. We get to see Bashir brought low, for example, a feat made all the more impactful for now knowing he's basically a genetic Superman. Showing the smartest guy in the room can be outplayed is certainly something worth exploring, so we'll give points for how that helps ground Bashir in reality, whilst also displaying just how capable Section 31 is. We'll also give points for Sloan's visit at the end. Is it him showing off? Is it him genuinely complimenting Bashir? Is it him seemingly complimenting Bashir for the hopes of further cultivating him as an asset in the future? Is it Sloan needing to remind himself of why he continues to do what he does? Is it perhaps all of those things? A final batch of points go to using an Intrepid-class ship for our trip to Romulus. The Defiant would have been less of a headache logistically, as those sets are specifically for DS9, but an Intrepid makes a little more sense for carrying around diplomatic envoys. It's faster for one, and significantly more pleasant to exist in for another. We're reusing sets from Voyager, of course, and that's led to some people pointing out what they consider a continuity error. The mess hall set is used in this episode, and Voyager's mess hall has the captain's dining room replaced with a galley shoved in by Neelix. On other Intrepid-class ships, this room simply does not exist in the same configuration. Thing is, nobody in this episode actually refers to it as the mess hall, and neither is anybody seen eating in there. The galley section of the set is walled off and the serving counter changed to a bar. It could easily be a recreational area somewhere else on the ship. Even if it's not a dedicated diplomatic vessel, which feels like a thing Starfleet would have, then I don't think it's a stretch for any vessel potentially carrying diplomats to have a place for getting drunk. If not for the guests themselves, then for the crew who need to tolerate being around them. Regardless, I'd argue somebody repurposing a set to perform a different function and hiding the bulk of the Voyager-specific alterations in the process is sufficient to call this one a fair effort, rather than punish people for trying to do something a little different. Before we go, we have a couple more entries into the Babylon 5 crossover club. John Fleck, who plays Koval, has been on DS9 a couple of times previously, but we've neglected to draw attention to him. He was also Del Varner in the Babylon 5 pilot film The Gathering. Our second entrant is Adrienne Barbeau, who plays today's version of Kretak. She was Amanda Carter in the second season episode Spider in the Web. End of episode, but not end of video. Space Dog's skipping this one. Wanker. So I can warn you that I'm having a week off over Christmas. You'll have to make do without the ponderings of an internet random for the next Friday and Tuesday, as I'd rather like to experience something approaching a normal festive period instead of working through it like I have for the last couple of years. As such, videos on Friday the 26th and Tuesday the 30th of December will not be happening. Service will resume on Friday the 2nd of January 2026, where we'll start the final arc of DS9's 7-year story. May your holiday season be as merry or as quiet as you'd like it to be, and I'll see you all in a little over a week.